Bobby Moore, the eternal captain of English football, the Upton Park Academy, had a peculiar way of recognizing talent. Young Bobby Moore, growing up in the shadow of West Ham's modest ground in East London, possessed qualities that didn't immediately announce themselves through physical dominance or explosive athleticism. He was tall, certainly, with the kind of posture that suggested military discipline even as a boy. But what truly set him apart was something less tangible, an understanding of the game that seemed to transcend his years, a composure in pressure situations that belied his age, and a natural authority that made teammates instinctively defer to his judgment. Ron Greenwood, West Ham's manager, first noticed Moore during a reserve match when the young defender was barely 17. The boy's positioning was almost perfect, his reading of play several seconds ahead of his opponents, his decision-making precise and economical. Most remarkably, despite being outnumbered and physically overmatched, Moore seemed to impose his will on proceedings through intelligence rather than force. Greenwood immediately recognized he was watching something special, not just a good young defender, but potentially a generational talent. Moore's debut for West Ham's first team came at 18, and he played with a maturity that shocked observers. Veteran strikers who'd spent years battering defenders found themselves oddly ineffective against this slender young man who seemed to anticipate their movements before they occurred, who positioned himself with such precision that physical challenges became irrelevant. After one particularly impressive performance, a supporter approached Greenwood in the corridor. "That Moore boy. He plays like he's 40 years old. Where does he get that composure from?" Greenwood smiled, understanding the observation perfectly. "He doesn't play with his body, he plays with his mind. That's rarer than physical talent. That's how champions are made." The early years at West Ham proved transformative for Moore's development. Greenwood became more than a manager. He was a mentor who understood that Moore's education extended beyond tactical instruction. The boy needed to understand leadership, responsibility, the weight that came with being better than everyone around him. After matches, Greenwood would invite Moore to his office, and they'd discuss not just football, but philosophy, character, what separated good players from truly great ones. "You have a gift, Bobby. The ability to make difficult decisions looks simple, but gifts carry responsibility. Every time you step on that pitch, younger players are watching you, learning from you. Your standards become their standards." Moore internalized these lessons completely. By his early 20s, he'd become West Ham's captain, an extraordinary achievement for someone so young. But the responsibility seemed to energize rather than overwhelm him. He led by example, arriving early for training, staying late, maintaining standards that eventually became the club's foundation. Teammates recognized that they played differently when Moore was present, that his calm authority elevated everyone around him. His relationship with West Ham was unique. Unlike many talented players who viewed their clubs as stepping stones to larger institutions, Moore developed a genuine affection for West Ham that transcended professional obligation. The club had made him, had provided the environment where his talents could flourish, and he felt a debt of loyalty that would define his career choices. When bigger clubs came calling, and they did regularly, Moore consistently chose to remain at Upton Park, turning down opportunities that would have provided greater immediate prestige or financial reward. This loyalty was tested in 1964 when Manchester United, one of England's greatest clubs, expressed serious interest in acquiring Moore. The financial offer was substantial, the prestige enormous. Moore sat in Greenwood's office, genuinely conflicted for perhaps the first time in his career. "Should I go, Ron? Manchester United is Manchester United. This could be my chance to win at the highest level." Greenwood leaned back in his chair, choosing his words carefully. "Bobby, you can win at any level if you're determined enough. West Ham will win with you. I promise you that." And more importantly, you'll be building something here, something that means something. At Old Trafford, you'd be another talented player in an organization that's already won everything. Here, you'd be the foundation of something special. Moore chose to stay. Within 2 years, West Ham had won the FA Cup, with Moore captaining them to victory. The triumph proved Greenwood's words prophetic. The young captain had indeed built something special at a club that many considered provincial. But the FA Cup was merely a prelude to something far greater that awaited Moore on the international stage. England's football manager, Alf Ramsey, had been watching Moore develop with keen interest. Ramsey was building a national team with a specific philosophy: English determination combined with continental sophistication, a balance between physical presence and technical quality. Moore embodied this perfectly. At 23, the West Ham captain was selected to lead England's defence during the qualification matches for the 1966 World Cup. The responsibility of playing for England was something Moore embraced completely. Unlike some players who viewed international football as peripheral to their club careers, Moore understood that representing your country was the ultimate honour. He studied opponents obsessively, prepared with scientific precision, and approached each match with the understanding that he was representing not just himself, but an entire nation. His performances during the qualification campaign were exceptional, drawing praise from managers across Europe who recognized that England had unearthed an extraordinary defensive talent. By 1965, Bobby Moore had become not just West Ham's captain, but a genuine contender for the England captaincy. Ramsey recognized that Moore possessed qualities that transcended football: an innate dignity, an ability to inspire confidence through his mere presence, a tactical intelligence that could elevate teammates. When Ramsey offered Moore the captaincy ahead of the 1966 World Cup, it felt less like an extraordinary honor and more like the inevitable recognition of his standing. Moore accepted with characteristic humility, understanding the magnitude of what Ramsey had entrusted to him. Leading England in a World Cup on home soil represented the pinnacle of football achievement. At 25, he would become one of England's youngest captains in modern history, shouldering the weight of national expectation at an age when most players were still developing their careers. The 1966 World Cup on English soil carried expectations that bordered on religious fervour. England hadn't won the tournament before, and the nation desperately wanted this moment, wanted to prove that English football was supreme. Bobby Moore, as captain, bore the weight of those expectations with a dignity that somehow made the burden feel lighter for everyone around him. Alf Ramsey had constructed a team that reflected Moore's values: disciplined, organized, intelligent, with physical presence married to tactical sophistication. The opening matches established England's credentials. Moore captained with a quiet authority that didn't require shouting or theatrical gestures. He led by positioning, by making the right decision at the right moment, by communicating with his defenders in tones that were firm but never harsh. Opponents quickly recognized that beating Moore wasn't about overpowering him physically. It was about outthinking him tactically, a task that proved remarkably difficult. During a particularly challenging group match, England faced a physically dominant opponent determined to disrupt England's rhythm through aggression and intimidation. Moore's teammates, feeling the pressure mounting, began to show signs of frustration, but their captain remained composed, organizing the defense with calm instructions, making crucial clearances at critical moments, seemingly anticipating danger before it materialized. When the final whistle confirmed England's victory, teammates approached Moore in the tunnel. "How do you stay so calm when everything's chaos around you?" one asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "Because panic helps no one. When everyone around you is uncertain, someone has to project confidence. That's my job." The quarter-final against Argentina presented a different challenge. The South Americans were technically gifted, fast, dangerous on the counter-attack. They tested England relentlessly, but Moore was immense, reading the play with uncanny accuracy, making last-ditch tackles that seemed impossible, distributing the ball from deep with precision that initiated England's attacks. His performance against Diego Maradona's precursor, the exciting young Argentine talent, demonstrated that Moore could compete with world-class opponents whilst maintaining his discipline and composure. The semi-final against Portugal brought a moment that would define Moore's captaincy forever. With England pressing for victory, a misunderstanding in communication led to a Portuguese break. Suddenly, England's defence was exposed, with only Moore between the opposition and the goal. A striker was bearing down on him, and the crowd held its breath. Moore, rather than panicking or committing recklessly, stayed patient, read the striker's intention perfectly, and made a tackle of such timing and precision that it appeared he'd stolen the ball rather than made a defensive intervention. What happened next exemplified Moore's character. Rather than simply clearing the danger, he immediately looked to distribute the ball, initiating a counter-attack that led to an England goal. In one movement, he'd transformed defending from a reactive situation into the catalyst for attack. Ramsey watched from the dugout, his expression showing the satisfaction of witnessing a masterclass in positional play. "That's Bobby Moore," he said to his assistant. "That's what separates the great from the good. He doesn't just stop the danger, he eliminates it and creates opportunity simultaneously." The final itself against West Germany represented the culmination of Moore's leadership journey. Wembley Stadium was a cauldron of noise, the entire nation focused on this single match. Moore had never experienced pressure like this before, had never felt the weight of an entire country's expectations crystallized into 90 minutes. But as he walked out of the tunnel, leading England onto the pitch, he felt curiously calm. This was what he'd been preparing for his entire career. The match itself unfolded like a drama written by football gods. England took the lead through a header, then Germany equalized, the momentum swinging back and forth. As the match progressed towards its climax, Moore's influence became increasingly apparent. He organized England's defense with meticulous precision, making crucial interceptions, clearing danger repeatedly, and most importantly, projecting an aura of control that seemed to steady his teammates. Extra time arrived, and both teams pressed forward desperately. In the 120th minute, the moment arrived that would define Moore's captaincy forever. Geoff Hurst scored England's fourth goal, and when the final whistle blew, confirming England's 3-2 victory in extra time, the entire nation erupted in celebration. Moore had led England to the World Cup, had captained his country to the greatest achievement in English football history. The image of Moore lifting the World Cup trophy, his face reflecting both exhaustion and profound satisfaction, would become iconic. But what struck observers most was his composure in that moment. Even holding aloft the greatest prize in football, Moore maintained his characteristic dignity. He wasn't overcome by emotion or theatrical celebration. Instead, he appeared to be savoring the moment with the kind of quiet satisfaction that characterized his entire approach to the game. In the dressing room afterwards, as teammates celebrated with abandon, Moore sat for a moment in contemplation. Ramsey found him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Bobby, you did it. You led us to it." "We did it together, boss, but I'm honored to have carried the trophy for England." The modesty was characteristic. Moore had just captained his nation to the World Cup, had performed at a level that transcended football into the realm of national mythology. Yet he credited his teammates whilst barely acknowledging his own extraordinary contribution. This quality, the ability to lead without ego, to accept supreme achievement with grace, defined what made Moore not just a great footballer but a great human being. The years following the World Cup triumph represented a curious paradox for Bobby Moore. Domestically, he was recognised as perhaps the greatest defender in English football history, a player whose intelligence and composure had elevated him beyond mere technical excellence into the realm of legend. Yet internationally, despite remaining captain and continuing to perform at an extraordinary level, the glory of 1966 proved impossible to replicate. England would never win another World Cup during Moore's playing career, a fact that haunted him with quiet intensity. His loyalty to West Ham remained absolute throughout the 1960s, whilst other World Cup winners accepted lucrative offers from larger clubs. Moore continued to captain the Hammers, leading them to another FA Cup triumph in 1964. The club had become part of his identity, and he seemed genuinely content to remain at Upton Park, developing younger players, maintaining standards, and proving that sustained excellence was possible at any level if you were willing to demand it from yourself and those around you. But by the late 1960s, the whispers began. Moore was approaching 30, and whilst his performances remained exceptional, the inevitable conversation about his future inevitably arose. Ron Greenwood, the manager who'd nurtured Moore's development from teenager to world champion, approached him with a proposal that would test his legendary loyalty. "Bobby, Tottenham wants you. Bill Nicholson has made a serious offer. He wants you to finish your career at White Hart Lane to help them compete for titles." Moore listened carefully, genuinely torn for perhaps the only time in his career. Tottenham represented a final opportunity to compete for major trophies at the highest level. West Ham, whilst beloved, weren't going to win the league title or the European Cup. At 30, Moore possessed perhaps 5 years of elite performance remaining. Should he spend those years at a club unlikely to challenge for the biggest prizes? Or should he accept one final opportunity to pursue glory? The decision didn't come easily. Moore arranged a private conversation with Greenwood, sitting in the manager's office late one afternoon, the stadium empty around them. "Ron, I need your honest opinion. Have I done everything I can at West Ham?" Greenwood considered the question carefully before responding. "You've done more than that, Bobby. You've transcended what a single player can accomplish, but I won't tell you to stay just because I want you to. You've earned the right to make decisions based on what's best for you. If you want to win the league title, to compete in Europe at the highest level, then you should go. You've given West Ham everything." Moore transferred to Tottenham in 1964, becoming one of the most significant signings in the club's history. At Spurs, he brought the same standards that had defined his West Ham career. Younger players watched how he prepared, how he maintained concentration, how he elevated his level on the biggest occasions. His partnership with other Spurs defenders transformed them into one of England's most formidable defensive units. The move to Tottenham also provided an unexpected benefit: proximity to London's elite social circles. Moore, always articulate and possessed of natural charm, flourished in the cultural environment that Spurs' location provided. He became something beyond a footballer. He was a public figure, invited to events, recognized in restaurants, treated as a representative of English sporting achievement and elegance. But with this elevated status came complications. In 1969, Moore was arrested in Mexico during a tour with England, accused of theft. The incident, which was later determined to be a misunderstanding with no charges ultimately filed, nonetheless created a brief period of intense scrutiny and concern. For a player whose entire identity was built on integrity and discipline, the accusation struck deeply, even though he was ultimately exonerated. Sitting in his hotel room in Mexico, facing accusations he knew were false, Moore experienced perhaps the darkest moment of his career. He'd built everything on a foundation of respectability and honor, and suddenly That was being questioned in the most public way imaginable. "I don't understand how this could happen," he told Alf Ramsey during a private conversation. "I've never done anything dishonest in my life. Everything I've built, everything I stand for, it's all based on doing the right thing." Ramsey's response was characteristically measured and supportive. "I know you're innocent, Bobby. Everyone who knows you knows that. This will pass, and you'll be vindicated. Your character is stronger than any accusation." The vindication came, but it left scars. Moore returned to England with his reputation intact, but with a deeper understanding of how fragile public perception could be, how quickly judgment could swing based on circumstance rather than character. He also developed a greater empathy for others facing unjust accusations, a compassion born from experiencing injustice firsthand. The 1970s brought a different phase of Moore's career. Now in his mid-30s, he could no longer rely on pace or physical dominance. Instead, he evolved, becoming even more intelligent in his positioning, reading the game with an almost supernatural ability to anticipate danger. Younger opponents who tried to overcome him through athleticism would find themselves repeatedly outmaneuvered by a defender who seemed to be 3 steps ahead of them mentally. His captaincy of England continued throughout this period, though the team's failure to replicate the World Cup glory created an underlying frustration. Moore remained committed to the national team, playing 54 matches as captain, but the absence of another World Cup triumph bothered him deeply. In his mind, 1966 felt incomplete somehow, a peak that should have been followed by further summits conquered. At Tottenham, Moore became an elder statesman, mentoring younger players and maintaining standards that others might have relaxed given his age and status. Bill Nicholson, Spurs' legendary manager, spoke about Moore with reverence. "Bobby Moore is the finest defender I've ever managed, not just technically, but as a person. He represents what football should be: intelligent, disciplined, dignified." The recognition was welcome, but Moore's primary focus remained on performance. He continued to demand excellence from himself, refusing to coast on reputation or past achievements. Every match was approached with the professionalism that had defined his entire career, whether playing for Tottenham's reserves or leading England against the world's best strikers. The end came quietly, as befitted Bobby Moore's character, after a career spanning nearly 2 decades at the highest level, after captaining England, after establishing himself as arguably the greatest defender in English football history. Moore's final matches arrived with little fanfare. At 36, with nearly 1,000 professional appearances behind him, his body finally began to show the cumulative effects of elite-level football played at the highest intensity. His final international cap came against Italy in 1973, England playing a friendly match at Wembley. Moore walked out of the tunnel for what would be his last appearance in an England shirt, though neither he nor anyone else knew it at the time. The match itself was unremarkable, but Moore's performance was characteristic. Intelligent positioning, perfect reading of the game, leadership that elevated teammates. When the final whistle blew, confirming England's victory, Moore shook hands with opponents and jogged back into the tunnel, unaware that he'd just played his final match for his country. The retirement came not with announcement, but with gradual realization. By 1974, Moore recognized that his body couldn't sustain the demands he placed upon it, that younger defenders were beginning to overtake him athletically, if not yet intellectually. Rather than diminish gradually, appearing in fewer matches and watching from the bench as others took his position, Moore made the decision to retire while still capable of performing at a respectable level. It was the same philosophy that had guided all his major decisions. Leave at your peak, maintain your standards, don't let decline define your legacy. His final match came in a relatively undistinguished fixture A league match that meant little in the grand scheme of things, but meant everything to Moore as a bookend to his remarkable career. As he walked off the pitch for the final time, supporters gave him an ovation, though few understood they were witnessing the conclusion of an era. Moore removed his boots in the dressing room one last time, holding them for a moment, reflecting on everything they'd carried him through. In the months following retirement, Moore struggled with the transition in ways he hadn't anticipated. For nearly 20 years, his identity had been entirely bound up in football. He was Bobby Moore the footballer, Bobby Moore the World Cup winner, Bobby Moore the defender. Without that structure, without the daily routine of training and matches, without the sense of purpose that competition provided, he found himself adrift in unfamiliar territory. Bill Nicholson, who'd managed Moore at Tottenham, remained a close friend after retirement and recognized the struggle his former captain was experiencing. "Bobby, you're defining yourself only by what you've done on the pitch, but you're so much more than that. You're intelligent, articulate, charming. There's a whole life waiting for you beyond football." Moore took the advice to heart, slowly building a post-playing career. Broadcasting opportunities came quickly, with his intelligent analysis and natural communication skills making him a natural fit for television commentary. Business ventures followed, with Moore's name and reputation opening doors that would have remained closed to others. But none of these activities fully replaced the sense of purpose that football had provided. The years following his retirement saw Moore become a statesman of the game, invited to major matches, consulted on matters of football governance, recognized as one of the game's great minds. At major tournaments, he was a regular presence, his observations sought by media, his presence lending gravitas to the event. But there remained an undercurrent of melancholy, a sense that Moore was living in the shadow of his playing career rather than creating something new in his post-playing life. His relationship with West Ham remained profound throughout his retirement. Despite leaving the club in his prime to join Tottenham, Moore never lost his affection for Upton Park. He would return regularly, watching matches and eventually taking on ambassadorial roles at the club that had made him. The supporters, who might have harbored resentment at his departure, instead revered him as the greatest player to ever wear the club's colours. In 1993, 20 years after his final match, Moore was diagnosed with cancer. The disease that would eventually claim his life seemed impossibly cruel. A man whose entire identity had been built on control and precision, suddenly facing an opponent that couldn't be tackled or read through intelligent positioning. Yet Moore faced it with the same composure that had defined every aspect of his career. During his final illness, tributes poured in from around the world. Players he'd competed against, managers who'd worked with him, supporters who'd watched him perform, all recognized that they'd witnessed something exceptional. But what struck observers most was how Moore seemed to face death with the same dignity he'd faced everything else in his life. There was no self-pity, no anger, just an acceptance of circumstance combined with an appreciation for the extraordinary life he'd lived. "I've been blessed," he told close friends during his final days. "I captained my country to the World Cup. I played at the highest level for nearly 20 years. I've known the greatest glory football can offer. How can I complain about anything?" When Bobby Moore passed away in 1993, the football world mourned the loss of not just a great player, but a great man. Testimonials spoke not primarily of his defensive skills or his tactical intelligence, though these were acknowledged reverently. Instead, people spoke of his character, his integrity, his refusal to compromise his principles, even when it would have been easier to do so. His legacy extended far beyond statistics. Moore had redefined what it meant to be a defender, proving that the position could be played with elegance and intelligence rather than mere physicality. He'd shown that it was possible to be the most competitive person on the pitch whilst remaining fundamentally decent off it. He demonstrated that true leadership came not from shouting or theatricality, but from setting standards through personal example and maintaining them with unwavering consistency. The greatest tribute came years after his death, when the World Cup trophy itself was displayed in a museum alongside a photograph of Bobby Moore lifting it at Wembley. The image had become iconic, not just because of what it represented in terms of English football achievement, but because of what it said about Moore's character. Even holding aloft the greatest prize in sport, his expression was one of quiet satisfaction rather than unbridled celebration. He looked like a man who'd done his duty, who'd led his team to victory, and who was satisfied with having performed at his highest level. Bobby Moore remains the template for what a defender should be, what a captain should represent, what a professional should demand of himself. Decades after his death, young defenders still study his positioning, his reading of the game, his remarkable ability to be in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. But more importantly, they study his character, his dignity, his absolute refusal to compromise his principles. In an age of football increasingly defined by ego and spectacle, Bobby Moore's legacy reminds us that true greatness is built on foundation of character, that the manner in which you achieve is as important as what you achieve, and that true immortality comes not from trophies, but from the way you're remembered by those who knew you,